women over 40, okay, that are in perimenopause. They're gaining the weight. They're starting to have the hot flashes. And then they look and go, what should I be eating? Is there anything that I could be eating to help these symptoms?
Some women during peri and postmenopause go through some hormonal changes that can influence things like their energy expenditure and their caloric intake, okay? Because there can be changes in hormones that are associated with hunger and cravings that can make you crave some foods that you typically don't eat that much. So it makes it more difficult to control your food intake. Maybe you're snacking on ice cream a little bit more than you should, perhaps, right? And then some women can have issues with their thyroid as well. And thyroid hormone production is tightly associated with your basal metabolic rate, which is just how many calories your body burns at rest, right? And when we talk about weight loss and weight gain, God, I could talk about this for a really long time.
I know, I can too. Hi, and welcome back to Chillin' with Ice. I'm your host, Lori Fetrick, and I'm the former American Gladiator, Ice Ice Baby.
We are Chillin' with Ice.
Welcome to Chillin' with Ice, and today's guest is Dr. Joey Munoz. He has his Ph.D. in nutrition science. He has a passion to help people navigate the waters in nutrition by debunking so much fitness and nutritional myths. He has a podcast and a coaching program with educational content, and we're going to get more into what Joey does. And right now, let's just get into having a conversation with him. Joey Munoz, thank you so much for coming on my podcast today.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Now, I have to tell my listeners where I found you because of the fact that, I have so much content flowing through my IG constantly, and you kept coming up and I kept watching it and everything was, really cool. And then I went on your page and I started stalking you, and I loved everything that you were saying because
Sweet.
It was just insane of how much information is out there. But before we go there, tell me a little bit more about your background and how you got into wanting to get your PhD in nutritional science.
Oh man, this could be a long story, but I'll keep it short.
Give me the short version of it.
Yeah, so my passion for health and fitness really started at a young age because both my parents were living a healthy lifestyle. I pretty much grew up going to the gym with my mom. My dad would come home from work and like bang out some push-ups at home. And my mom was always into like making super healthy meals. And ironically enough, I was pretty overweight as a young teenager. And so my mom didn't know much about nutrition, but she put me on like all of these diets, and I started exercising a ton. And I never really so I used to swim competitively. I used to do a bunch of like endurance-based exercises. I never really liked endurance movements too much. And then when I was about 15 or 16, that's when I really started lifting weights. As I said, both of my parents were into lifting weights, and the rest is kind of history. During undergraduate in college, I started taking some nutrition courses, some exercise science courses, realized I really liked it. And I've never been one to like think of what my long-term goal is. I've kind of just like seen what options I have at the moment and take the best option. And I remember finishing undergrad, or towards the end of undergrad, thinking like, I can't really do much with a bachelor's degree in nutrition, and I kind of like school, so we'll just go for a master's degree. And so I went for a master's degree, and then during my master's degree, I met a professor who ended up being my mentor during my PhD, and he approached me and he was like, hey, would you want to do a PhD with me? And I didn't really know what a PhD was. And I remember telling him like, hey, this whole master's thing is really expensive and I'm in debt for just a 2-year degree. And he was like, oh, no, if you do a PhD, we actually pay for your school and we pay you a stipend on top of that to teach. I was like, so you're telling me school's free and I get paid?
You're like a score.
Like, yeah. And I was like, all right, let's do it.
Sign me up.
That was the deciding factor. Aside from the fact that I really liked science, I really liked school. That was kind of really the cherry on top, right? That made me decide to do a PhD. And then during a PhD, for those that don't know, essentially you spend 4 years producing research. So you're working in the lab, conducting research. I did a ton of work looking at, really in the field that I was in is like functional nutrition, looking at the disease preventative effects of different foods. So we worked on things like black beans and plaque buildup in your arteries. Can it help prevent atherosclerosis? We did some work with like prediabetes. My dissertation or my PhD project ended up being on the effects, this is a funny one, of prunes, so dried plums on bone health. And for postmenopausal women, it's actually very beneficial to help them reduce the rate of bone loss as you age.
Oh,
So
we're
that was
going to
kind
get
of
into
my
that.
background and how I ended up doing my, yeah, that's how I ended up doing my PhD. And then I ended up in the whole fitness space because, again, I've been into fitness. I was a personal trainer before my PhD. After my PhD, I did what's called a postdoc, which is kind of like additional research work in a sports nutrition field, in the sports nutrition field, to get my feet wet in a little bit more sports nutrition fitness. And then I worked with somebody called Lane Norton. You may or may not know him. He's a huge name in the fitness space, and I worked with his coaching company. And now I own my own coaching company. So that's kind of the short story there.
That is fascinating. I love that. Let's get into it's fascinating because you talked about, you did a lot of research on different foods and everything like that.
Sure.
Don't you find that, I want to say this, all the doctors out there, the MDs, you know, I mean, if they took more nutritional programming, I mean, in their schooling, don't you think that would be so beneficial to them? But they literally, doctors know nothing about that field, or they just tend to not, they don't care. They're just like, take a pill, do this, instead of going, okay, well, let's look at what you're eating. Let's look at what you're putting in your body, because what we're putting in our body is literally affecting every single cell in our body. But yet they would just rather give us a pill and just, you know, go, here, just take this, you'll be fine. Instead of,
Yeah. Listen, I think in every field there's good and bad practitioners, right? And that's just the honest truth. When it comes to medical doctors, yes, I wish there was probably a little bit more education on the nutrition side of things. But there's also, there's a reason why there are nutrition professionals, right? I just wish it was a more integrated medical system.
there you have it.
Where there was a little bit more of an emphasis on nutrition, and maybe all patients work closely with a dietitian.
Yes.
And then there would be a division of responsibility where they see a doctor for their medical recommendations, and then they work with their dietitian for their nutritional recommendations. And there is some of that, but there's not a lot of it, right? And it's definitely not emphasized nearly as much. And as you mentioned, nutrition is incredibly important, right? Now, I think there's also a division here between medical doctors who are doing their job and then medical doctors online giving nutrition advice, right? Those are two different things.
Yes.
And the latter can be a little bit dangerous because you mentioned they just don't have a ton of education in the space, and people tend to trust doctors because, hey, it's my doctor, right? And you would assume that they know a lot about nutrition, and some do, but the vast majority don't. It's like, I don't go online and tell people what medical treatment they should be getting because I'm not a medical doctor, right? So yeah, I definitely see the issue there. I wish I had a solution for it, though. That's why I do what I do on social media, which is debunking a lot of these things.
So speaking of which, I'm gonna kind of go into some really just short little questions, but I've got to know.
Sure.
Okay, like right now, what's happening that I hear online is, drink almond milk, don't drink almond milk. Drink coconut milk, don't drink coconut milk. It's like that whole thing right there. It's like, what should we be putting in our shakes? I mean, and is almond milk as bad as people are saying right now? Because when it came out, it was like the one thing to drink.
Okay, so standard recommendation for anybody that falls for these things. If anybody ever talks about nutrition in black and white terms, this is good or this is bad, it's just wrong.
Okay.
Because when it comes to nutrition, context really matters. Because we don't eat foods in isolation, right? So the totality of your diet really matters. You need to contextualize the thing you're consuming in the context of your overall diet. For example, almond milk, whatever it is, like people talk about saturated fat being bad, right? And these are things that we have more data. Something like almond milk, there is no good or bad. It's just almond milk. Do you like it? Sure, have it, right? Are you having too much of it? Are you going over on your calories? Are you gaining weight? Well, then maybe reduce it, right? Like, it's context specific. But even things that we know that can be harmful, like saturated fat for your risk of cardiovascular disease, again, it really depends because some people are more sensitive than others. There's genetic predispositions. It also depends on how much total saturated fat you're consuming. So like if you're having a little bit of it, it's not inherently bad at all. Actually, it has many health benefits. So everything depends on whether it's too much or too little.
So moderation.
What are your genetics? Yeah, exactly. And the other aspect of it is, Lori, it's like, listen, I have my PhD in nutrition, but I recognize that nutrition is just one piece of the puzzle. People put so much of an emphasis on food, and yes, it is important. But if you're trying to if you're worrying about like almond milk or not, or sweetened with this or sweetened with that, and you're not exercising and you're not sleeping well, what the hell are you doing, right? You're like wasting your time and energy. So all of the pieces of the puzzle really matter there. But to answer your question directly, almond milk, what are other controversial ones? Dairy in general,
Yes.
or like particular seeds and nuts or certain veggies. Whenever anybody talks about a specific food being good or bad in any context, it's just wrong.
Okay. So I'm old school, old school. When I was bodybuilding and I was doing all my competitions, we're talking like, okay, none of this conversation was around. And so my daily, I mean, I look back and I laugh about how really bad it was. You know, when I was in competition mode for 8 weeks, all I would eat is either boiled, and I say boiled because we didn't even bake, fry, do anything with our chicken breast, our fish. I mean, it was absolutely disgusting. And then it was steamed broccoli, and if I was lucky that day, maybe I had a half a baked potato. There weren't any healthy fats involved. There was, I mean, nobody talked about the fiber. I mean, all these things that we talk about now, there was no talk back then. And I always say, if I knew back then what I know now, it would have been a whole different, ball game. But I mean, again, nutrition and all these different myths and hacks and debunking things. I mean, it's all over the internet. And I loved how one of your posts said, if you're trying to get your information off of IG, get off of social media because you're not going to get the education you need in a 30 to 60 second video. And absolutely, I mean, these are just made for little tidbits to go, hey, go watch my podcast. Hey, go listen to this. Go to my coaching program.
Yeah.
But there are different things out there that people are still seeking out. Okay, so like let's take women over 40, okay, that are in perimenopause. And let's just take their environment. Okay, I'm going to give you a scenario. Let's just say they're in a healthy environment. They're starting to have perimenopause. They're gaining the weight. They're starting to have the hot flashes. And then they look and go, what should I be eating? Is there anything that I could be eating to help these symptoms?
Yeah. It's a really good question. And I actually work with a decent amount of women in that age range as well. And there's a couple of things to consider here. So when women go through menopause, it doesn't inherently cause you to gain weight, but there are some hormonal changes that can contribute to weight gain. Okay. And I think it's important to consider this because I don't like people feeling like they're helpless and they can't do anything, right? The truth is you can do a lot to improve. And there are a lot of women who are perimenopausal or even postmenopausal in fantastic shape, right? So there's proof that it can be done. It can be more difficult. Now, here's the thing. Some women during peri and postmenopause go through some hormonal changes that can influence things like their energy expenditure and their caloric intake, okay? Because there can be changes in hormones that are associated with hunger and cravings that can make you crave some foods that you typically don't eat that much. So it makes it more difficult to control your food intake. Maybe you're snacking on ice cream a little bit more than you should, perhaps, right? And then some women can have issues with their thyroid as well. And thyroid hormone production is tightly associated with your basal metabolic rate, which is just how many calories your body burns at rest, right? And when we talk about weight loss and weight gain, God, I could talk about this for a really long time.
I know, I can too.
It comes down to energy burns, right? If you consume less calories and your body burns, you lose weight. And the opposite is true. If you eat more calories and your body burns, you gain weight. Now, that's an overly simplistic view because people talk about, what about the foods that you eat? What about your hormones? And the truth is that these things play into those variables, right? Your hormones can influence how many calories you burn. Your hormones can influence how many calories you eat, right? The foods you eat can also influence both of those variables. And so when somebody says something like, I'm eating very low calories and I'm not losing weight, calories don't matter. The fact is that their energy expenditure is probably really low due to a number of variables. Maybe it's hormonal imbalances. Maybe it's physical inactivity. Maybe it's the fact that they're a small person because a small person has lower energy expenditure than somebody who's bigger, right? Because your size plays into how much energy you burn. Anyways, all that's to say that women that go through menopause experience some of these changes that can be more difficult. And one thing that we do know is true is that although menopause doesn't necessarily result in weight loss inherently, it does result in a distribution in how we store fat, right? So women in general going through perimenopause tend to store a little bit more body fat in the midsection. It's like, hey, like have a little bit more fat in my belly. Like this is hard to get rid of. And that one, I think it's important to understand that it's part of normal aging. There's a change in your body composition, things start to change, right? And you are going to store a little bit more fat around your belly than you typically would. maybe you would store it in different areas at a younger age. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I got a question about that. Okay,
Yeah.
so everything that I've learned is around the belly, usually,
Uh-huh.
is when your cortisol levels are high. And if you're not getting enough sleep, your cortisol levels are going to raise. If you're not eating correctly, your cortisol levels are going to raise. And so this is what I have been obviously taught and know, that midsection belly section is usually because your cortisol levels are high. Am I incorrect?
I'm unsure if it's related to just cortisol. Here's the thing, like most of these variables tend to influence more than one thing. I'm sure cortisol probably plays a role. I think people also oversimplify the role of cortisol because cortisol is not just a bad thing.
Right.
Like cortisol is important for a number of different things,
course,
right? It's just
yes.
when it's chronically elevated.
Yes.
I honestly can't directly answer yes or no whether cortisol is responsible for just abdominal adiposity. It's a number of things. It's not just cortisol.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Some of these are also just inherent hormonal changes during menopause. But you asked, what can we do from a nutritional standpoint? From a nutritional standpoint, what I recommend is the same thing that I would recommend to anybody, right? There's nothing unique nutritionally that a woman going through perimenopause has to do. But in general, when it comes to your diet, if you're trying to reduce body fat, improve body composition, there's a couple things that we should do. And I like to break this down into three main variables. Like your diet should meet your nutritional needs. Duh. Right? Like you don't want to be deficient
like
in
that.
nutrients.
Duh.
You want to make sure that your protein, you should be consuming enough protein, carbs, and fats. You should be consuming enough micronutrients. You don't want to be deficient in anything. So your diet needs to meet those needs. Your diet should also help regulate your hunger, because if you're hungry all the time, it makes it more difficult to lose weight, right? And third, your diet should be enjoyable, because we don't just eat for body composition purposes. It's
Right.
pleasure too, right? So a healthy and sustainable diet does all three of those things. When it comes to the first one, it's pretty simple. If you're trying to lose body fat, you have to be in a slight calorie deficit. I emphasize the word slight because if you're losing weight too quickly, you're going to be hungry independent of what you're eating, and you're probably going to be nutrient deficient because you're just not consuming enough food to meet all of your nutrient needs, right? So slight deficit, really emphasize protein and fiber, because protein and fiber are also going to help with satiety, feeling full, right? And this is funny because you were talking about your bodybuilding diet, which is inherently a restrictive diet, right? You're only eating a handful of foods.
Right.
And boiled chicken is hilarious.
I know. You have no idea.
Yeah. I've always been into cooking, and my buddy in college, my freshman year of college, he's like, hey, let's go cook in the kitchen. And he tried boiling some chicken. I'm like, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Let's slice this in half, pound it down, season it, let's saute it. And he tried it, and he was like, oh my God, I can eat this. I was like,
Yes.
Anyways.
I would choke down my food literally every meal just to get food in me, and I hated every meal.
Yeah, that's hilarious. But what I was talking about with restricted diets, when we look at meeting your nutritional needs and having an overall healthy diet, the opposite is actually very beneficial. Having a more inclusive diet. So consuming a wide array of nutrient-dense, minimally processed foods, right? And this is funny because you were asking like good foods, bad foods, and there are all these people on social media demonizing specific foods that are like minimally processed whole foods, like beans or broccoli. And it's like, hey, the more foods you consume, when we look at the research data, there are better health outcomes. Why? Because different foods have different nutritional profiles, right? And you're getting different nutrients from different foods that you're not going to get if you cut them out. So you should be consuming your veggies. You should be consuming your fruits, your beans, your protein sources, dairy. As long as we're focusing on minimally processed foods, we're good to go. You don't have to worry about certain foods being bad unless you have a sensitivity or allergy to that particular food, okay? If we go a step beyond that and talk about managing hunger, and for women going through perimenopause, I would say these are the main things to focus on because they're going to help you feel fuller on lower calories, help you reduce body fat, right?
Right.
It really comes down to, as I mentioned, minimally whole unprocessed foods, right? Whole minimally processed foods. Anything that's just not highly processed. We know from the research that people who consume minimally processed foods eat less in terms of calories, period, right? Because it's more satiating. You feel fuller on less calories. In addition to that, highly processed foods don't inherently cause weight gain. They're just really easy to overeat, right? Like if you have a box of Cheez-Its or some ice cream, like it's so easy to eat 1,000 calories of that. It's so easy. And if you're eating some, maybe not boiled chicken, but maybe sauteed chicken breast, some potatoes that are, seasoned and flavored well, and some veggies, it still tastes really good. It's way harder to eat 1,000 calories, right? So minimizing highly processed foods, number one thing I would recommend. in terms of regulating hunger, there's actually really good data showing that having a regular meal schedule, which people tend not to prioritize. It's like, oh, it's lunchtime, I have to figure out what to eat. It's like, no. You should be prioritizing having meals at regular times. That helps regulate your hunger as well. If we're in this topic of meal timing, there's really good research too that eating more food earlier in the day versus later in the day results in greater energy expenditure and as well as better hunger regulation. So people who have a larger breakfast, smaller dinner compared to the opposite tend to have better health-related outcomes and body composition as well.
Now, that's been around for years. Definitely.
Yeah. And this is why, like, I'm not against things like intermittent fasting. I tend to see these things as tools that can be useful for different people. But when people are like, hey, if you want to lose fat, you have to intermittent fast and don't eat till 2 p.m. I'm like, no, that's not true at all, right? Like the opposite is true. That said, if you like intermittent fasting and it works for you, go ahead. Just don't preach that it's the best thing in the world, because it's not.
Right.
And then when we talk about food choices, I mentioned protein and fiber should be a priority at every meal. If you eat sufficient protein and fiber from whole foods, it's very hard to overeat, right? One rule that I put for that I have for myself is every meal I try to get 50 grams of protein from a minimally processed food, whether it's chicken, whether it's beef, whether it's fish. I don't care. 50 grams of protein, which tends to be 6 to 8 ounces of most protein sources, depending on how fat it is. A big handful of veggies. Like, I will literally just buy a thing of spring mix and grab a handful and put it on my plate. I can eat boring food. It is what it is.
I'm the same way. I'm like a creature of habit. Well, and
exactly.
And on that, when you were talking about your protein, for instance, I had, like, last night at dinner, I had a nice, I think it was like 7 ounces of a steak. I couldn't even finish it. It was a lot.
Yeah. It's satiating. Yep.
Yes.
Exactly.
And so the whole meal was smaller. Yeah,
exactly. I tell people, if you put enough protein and veggies / fiber on your plate, you can kind of put whatever else you want on your plate. Like, obviously don't put a ton of, like, I don't know, a pound of butter on a piece of toast or something like that, right? Like, exaggerating here. But if you really focus on consuming adequate protein and fiber at your meal, first and foremost, it's difficult to overeat. It really is. Because I spent years tracking calories and stuff, and I recommend my clients track calories to learn about this stuff. Like, I see calories as like a tool to learn about nutrition, not necessarily something that you have to do forever. But if you do that, and you focus on your protein and fiber, you really start to realize, like, oh, like, these foods really help me feel good and I'm not eating a ton of calories, right? And all that's to say, like, today, I haven't tracked calories in years. I just focus on these behaviors and it really helps me stay in a healthy body composition without hyperfixating on it, right?
I actually started tracking my calories just recently, only because I wanted to kind of check in and find out where I was at, because I get in that creature of habit and I get into these things. And on that note, I'm going to tell you an interesting thing too. Old school is you could only eat 25 grams of protein at one sitting because your body couldn't assimilate the rest of the protein, and it went into your fat cells. Remember that? And so now it's like, no, that's not true. So, I mean, when did I put that in the back of your mind? When did that all change? When did finally somebody come up and go, no, you can have 50 grams of protein if you want, at one sitting. You don't have to just do the 25 and 30 that we learned about years and years and years and years, because there wasn't this research done.
Exactly. Not only was there, it's not that there wasn't research, and I just think that it wasn't as mainstream for people to talk about research. That's really what it is, right? So, like, people would get their advice from the people that look the way that they wanted to look. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It makes sense. But some of those people don't have the education, perhaps, right? And maybe they just talk about, hey, this worked for me. This is my experience. And then somewhere along the way, threw in something of like 25 grams of protein, right? Like, and then that probably just stuck. I don't know where it comes from, but I know, like, so here's the thing. There is some evidence showing that there is an upper limit of how much protein you can consume in a feeding and use for what's called muscle protein synthesis specifically. That doesn't mean that you don't absorb all of the protein. That doesn't mean that you can't use it. That doesn't mean that there's no benefit to eating more protein than that. There certainly is. And some people should consume more protein depending on certain situations, like if they're in a calorie deficit or they're older, because they're not as primed, I would say, to use protein as somebody who's younger, perhaps, right? So all that's to say, you can eat as much protein as you want in one sitting and you will absorb it. Not all of it will be used for building muscle. Very little of it is actually used for building muscle regardless. Because if you think about 100 grams of protein, like, you don't put that on as muscle every day. You would be freaking Hulk in like 2 weeks, you know? But you do.
Oh,
use
don't
it.
say that
It's still
because
very
somebody's going to
beneficial.
hear that and go, I'm going to start doing
Yeah.
100 grams of protein.
Yeah. It's still very beneficial for regulating your hunger, and you can use protein for energy the same way you use other foods, right?
Right.
It's not as efficient, which is actually a good thing because you burn more calories metabolizing protein than you do carbs or fat.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Talking about, again, the food choices stuff, focusing on protein and fiber. And then beyond that, I tell my clients, hey, try to get 4 to 6 servings of fruits and veggies every day. Minimize added sugars. Again, not that they're inherently harmful, but what are added sugars in? Fruit juices, soda, candy.
Everything.
Yeah, well, you know, it depends also on the food because if something has a gram of added sugar, I don't care.
Right.
Like, that's not a big deal, right? It's like when something has 15, 20 grams of added sugar and
That's
you're
when
getting
you see
100
it?
calories and it does nothing for your hunger.
Okay.
Right? So it's all quantity specific as well. Again, nuance, right? It's not the added sugar itself is inherently bad. It's like, hey, if you're overdoing it, now you're eating too much and this is contributing to your overall caloric load, that's bad. But again, talking about context, for an athlete who is running a marathon, give them some fruit juice, give them stuff that has the added sugars because they're going to use it for energy immediately, right? So again, context matters.
Yes.
Where was I? So talking about hunger regulation, back to the boring science stuff.
Well, no, before, okay, I'm going to let you say the last thing and then I got another question about the sugar, but go ahead.
No, I was going to talk about like enjoying your diet as the next thing. So you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, so let's get into the sugar for just a moment because I do speak with a lot of people that, okay, for instance, can you actually get type 2 diabetes from stress and not so much consuming a shit ton of sugar?
Okay.
That's a good question.
This is a
specific because I have a family member. That's why I'm asking.
Because I think in theory, stress can contribute to the development of disease for sure.
Okay.
And we know that chronic stress increases your risk of things, not just like diabetes, but cardiovascular disease as well. It's because most of these chronic diseases, Lori, have the same etiology, meaning that they're caused by very similar things. Okay. So we've all heard of inflammation, right? Inflammation, again, isn't inherently bad because we need inflammation to survive. If we didn't have any inflammation, we would die, literally, because inflammation is the way we fight off like bacteria and viruses and things that are harmful to us. But when we are in a state of what's called chronic low-grade inflammation, it's bad. Okay. So inflammation, when we talk about inflammation, people don't even know what inflammation is. They're like, I feel bloated, I'm inflamed. That's not inflammation. That just means you're holding on to water and you're not digesting your food well. Like, that's not inflammation, okay? Inflammation is an immune response, okay? It's a response by your immune system and other tissues in your body as well. And it's characterized by an increase in what we call inflammatory cytokines, inflammatory molecules. So if you go to the doctor, they look at things like CRP, C-reactive protein, or TNF-alpha, tumor necrosis factor alpha. These are all different molecules that have inflammatory properties, okay? All that means is that it can essentially activate your immune system, okay? And what the hell does this have to do with diabetes? Well, things that contribute to chronic inflammation can contribute to the development of diabetes and development of cardiovascular disease, the development of osteoporosis, the development of most chronic diseases that people tend to have later in life or when they're really unhealthy, right? So weight gain itself, gaining body fat, contributes to low-grade chronic inflammation. Because when we have excess body fat, essentially our fat cells have capillaries surrounding them. We have blood flow to our blood cell, to our fat cells, right? And that blood delivers nutrients. It also delivers oxygen, right? Now, when we increase the amount of fat that we have, we don't have adequate blood supply to all of our fat cells, okay? And so our fat cells can be in what's called a hypoxic environment, which means a low oxygen environment. And when that happens, essentially the properties of the fat cell change to where they release more of these inflammatory molecules. And this is how gaining body fat can contribute to low-grade inflammation. And these molecules that I was talking about, CRP, TNF-alpha, there's like interleukin-6, there's a bunch of these molecules. They essentially inhibit the actions of insulin, so they contribute to insulin resistance. They can contribute to plaque buildup in your arteries. They can contribute to your arteries not being as elastic. So they have these overall negative impacts that then result in cardiovascular disease or diabetes. And stress, since you asked about stress, can also contribute to low-grade chronic inflammation, right? So if you're chronically stressed and it's not the stress itself, it's like how you handle that stress. If you don't handle that stress well, it can contribute to chronic low-grade inflammation. Physical inactivity can contribute to that. Poor sleep can contribute to that. Excess body fat can contribute to that. Poor dietary patterns can contribute to that. Alcohol intake can contribute to that, right? So it's like all these things cause these diseases based off a very similar mechanism, essentially.
Got it. Okay, so let's take a person that has type 2 diabetes, is actually very thin now, okay? Cut out like all their carbs completely and absolutely very fearful of raising their blood sugar at all whatsoever, but yet it's pretty much under control. But now she has a really hard time gaining weight because she doesn't really know what to eat. And she's like, there's only so many avocados I can eat, you know?
Yep. So if she's thin and her blood sugar is regular, then by definition, she's not really diabetic unless her blood sugar is elevated, but it's still regular. And obviously insulin resistance, it plays a role here as well. There's a couple things to talk about because there are people who are thin and they're type 2 diabetic. And you're like, what the hell's going on there? Most of them are very under-muscled.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So yes, body fat matters, but the ratio between how much fat and muscle you have also matters. Because the same way that I talked about the fact that fat can contribute to higher inflammation, which can contribute to insulin resistance, muscle has the opposite effect. It has very beneficial effects on things like insulin sensitivity and cardiovascular function. So based off BMI, the person might be normal weight, but based off body fat percentage, they might be obese. And like, not look at it could look thin, right? And this is what we call normal weight obese. Somebody who is thin, but they have a lot of fat relative to the composition of their overall body because they have very little muscle mass, right? The first thing I would say is, hey, resistance train and build some muscle.
Okay,
right?
so she's training.
Like,
I know that.
cool.
She is training, but maybe not quite heavy enough and maybe not taking in enough protein to actually build that
Protein's
muscle.
obviously important as well. I would not recommend avoiding all carbohydrates. It's not necessary. Again, if you're getting carbohydrates from minimally processed whole foods, it's healthy. It's funny because people talk about fruit for diabetics. Like, oh, diabetics need to avoid fruit. That's not true at all. Like if we look at a really, really well-designed controlled research, fruit consumption can help regulate diabetes because it's not just about the sugar consumption, right? It's about the total diet. And we know that fruit itself, like we talk about vitamins and minerals, but fruits and veggies have other nutrients, which we call phytonutrients, which have anti-inflammatory and antioxidative properties. They can be beneficial for insulin sensitivity. Like fruits and veggies have very unique properties outside of their just protein, carbs, and fats, right? Because everybody talks about the macronutrients. Nobody really focuses on the micronutrients and the phytonutrients. These tend to have a ton of health benefits as well. When I was talking about my PhD work, a lot of the work that we did was looking at the effects of these phytonutrients in different plant-based foods. So again, if the person is strategically consuming carbohydrates, using those around training to be able to train hard to build muscle, they're prioritizing their protein. Again, sleep is incredibly important. They're managing stress. You know, if you're talking about somebody who's chronically stressed, like that's something that needs to be controlled, right? Alcohol tends to be a big one for people as well. And the truth is also, Lori, which people don't want to accept, is like there's a genetic component as well. Like this can't be denied, right?
Right.
There's a reason why people with family history of cardiovascular disease have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So some people naturally have a little bit higher blood sugar. Some people naturally have a little bit higher insulin resistance, right? Some people are taller and some people are shorter. That's a dead giveaway of genetics. But when we talk about these other health-related markers, like people don't think about it the same way. It's the same thing, right? Like your genetics affect everything. Now the lifestyle stuff we can do to modify these things and improve it to the best of our ability. For this person that you know, there might be a slight genetic factor.
No, she's in my family. There is no genetic. She's actually in my, she's a family member. And that's why I was asking. And we don't have that in our family. So it's kind of odd how it came up. It's like, whoa, that's interesting.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, it is interesting. It definitely is interesting.
Yeah.
Uh,
But
it's
you're
hard
right,
to
though.
say without knowing more about the
I was
person.
just going to say, like you
Yeah.
said in the very beginning, it depends on their environment. It depends on their genetics. It depends on their blood work. It depends on so much. So even
Yeah.
when, we're talking diet and exercise and people coming to you and coming to me going, how do I lose weight? I want to dive down deep into, okay, let's really look at what's going on here. I can't just go, okay, eat this, train like this way, and you're going to lose weight. And then they come back and
Yeah.
go, I haven't lost a pound. Well, then let's dive in. So you can't necessarily do that. So I agree with you 100% on a lot of these people out there, they're just going, eat meat only, carnivore diet, whatchamacallit, what else? There's the keto, it's just the list goes on.
So if I can chime in here, because I forgot to mention something, this family member of yours, you said is avoiding carbohydrates at all costs.
Yes.
I'm assuming they're following a keto or a carnivore diet, correct?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So mechanistically, saturated fat inhibits the actions of insulin. It contributes to insulin resistance.
Okay.
So a ketogenic / carnivore style diet, I would not recommend for a diabetic.
Mm-hmm.
I would recommend a high protein, high fiber diet with moderate fat from healthy sources.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're eating a ton of saturated fat directly inhibits the actions of insulin. So it can contribute to insulin resistance as well. And if you're insulin resistant and you have a really high saturated fat diet, it's not a good combination there, right?
Got it.
It might help regulate your blood sugar because you're not consuming any carbohydrates, so your blood sugar is low. But there are some, because when we talk about diabetes, like we measure blood sugar. Blood sugar is really a proxy for other metabolic things going on, right, that are out of whack. Like we could measure your blood sugar and it could tell us like, hey, you're diabetic. But the blood sugar itself is not the issue. Like if you get the blood sugar in check and the other stuff is still going on, like that's not necessarily healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an oversimplification because high blood sugar is bad long term.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, hey, just because you're not eating no carbohydrates and now your blood sugar is low, that doesn't mean you're healthy either, because you still have a certain degree of insulin resistance, right? And a high fat diet isn't necessarily the best for that either. So for your family member, if they're listening to this, I highly recommend a high fiber
they are.
diet. Yeah. And hey, behind the scenes, if you want me to share some research with you, I'd be happy to.
Oh, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. All right. So now let's, and we're on that subject of the insulin. I mean, there's a couple people out there that are jumping on this insulin train, for everybody to lose weight, even if they're not diabetic. I know there's one woman on IG that flips through all the time. They're like, what your problem is your insulin. It's spiking. It's doing this. It's doing that. That's what's causing you to gain weight.
The primal blood.
Yes. I wasn't going to say it, but yes. And I look at her and I'm just like, because her husband's insulin resistant, and I'm just like, wow, not everybody is going to fall into this category, and to me, it's a little dangerous. That's just my take on it.
Well, here's the thing. It's because people focus on these like overly mechanistic things, and I'll explain what that means in a second, and they miss the big picture of what actually matters. So insulin, so when I talk about mechanistically, we're just talking about like what happens in your body at a cellular level, right? So like insulin binds here and it activates this protein and you release this thing. That's talking about mechanisms, right? That's what we talk about. That's the term mechanisms in biology. And so when we talk about mechanistically, what does insulin do? Insulin helps you uptake glucose, okay? So it helps you shuttle glucose from your blood into different tissues like your muscle and your liver, right? And it simultaneously slows down something called beta oxidation, which is how we break down fat essentially and turn it into energy, right? And people are like, oh my God, it stops you from burning fat. That means you're going to gain fat. And those two things are not synonymous. They're not, okay? First off, it makes sense. Your body throughout the day is either anabolic, aka storing stuff, growing, right? Or catabolic, aka breaking stuff down because it needs energy, right? So anytime you eat, you are in an anabolic state because you just ate food and your body's going to use that food, whether it's for energy or repairing tissue or storing it, right? We store fat all day, every day, every time we eat. The thing is, like, between your meals, you burn fat. So it's the ratio between how much you burn and how much you store in a given day that tells you whether you gained or lost net fat overall, right? I know this sounds a little bit confusing, but to get back to the insulin thing, yes, insulin slows down fat burning. Why? Because it makes sense that if you eat, why would your body burn fat when you just ate?
Right.
Right? Common sense. So anytime you eat, you actually slow down catabolic processes. So breaking down fat is a catabolic process, and you upregulate anabolic processes. Okay, so that's first and foremost. The second aspect is that, like, okay, if you eat low carbs, you keep your insulin low, so you're not stopping this fat burning thing, and so you burn more fat. Yes, that is true, but that is only one part of the picture. Because what happens when you eat low carbs? Yes, you burn more fat for energy. But what happens when you eat low carbs? You eat more fat. So what happens when you eat more fat? You store more fat. Guess what? When you eat fat, you can just store it as fat directly because it's already fat. When you eat carbohydrates, it's actually really difficult to turn carbohydrates into fats, right? It's like, yes, you're burning more fat, but hey, dummy, on the other side, you're storing more fat, right? And so now when you eat a higher carb diet, yes, you perhaps burn a little bit less fat for energy, but guess what? You store less fat. So again, it's the net difference between the two, and it's not the net difference is not influenced by whether you eat carbs or don't eat carbs. It comes down to energy intake because there's all of these redundant mechanisms to turn one thing into another, and it comes down to energy balance at the end of the day. There's really, really fantastic controlled research showing that when you control caloric intake, if somebody's on a high-fat, low-carb diet or a high-carb, low-fat diet, which I don't recommend either extreme, I recommend right down the middle, right? Like eat fats and eat carbs. But when you go either extreme, when total calories are accounted for and protein is equalized, there's no difference in weight loss, in fat loss specifically, which tells us that the total caloric intake is what really matters.
See, that is fascinating. I mean, I agree with you absolutely 100%. Everything that I've always learned throughout my entire journey, a balance. It's literally moderation, balance, healthy diet, exercise, put the muscle on. I mean, it's so, that to me is the most simplest thing in the world to do.
Yeah.
You know,
but
and
people don't want to put in the hard work, Lori. Like,
no,
that's
they
all
don't.
it is.
They don't.
Because it is hard work. Like, you do have to be disciplined. I think there are ways to make it easier because people do try to make it really hard on themselves, right? The last part of this nutrition thing was like, hey, you need to enjoy your diet. That's the part that people like ignore.
I know.
Right? They're like, hey, I'm going to go on a diet. It has to be super strict, super clean. That's like, that's a recipe for disaster, you know? Because you have to enjoy the way you eat, because you eat multiple times per day, every single day. And if you hate the way you eat, you're not going to stick to it. So I'm in this nutrition space. You know what bothers me more than anything? If I go to a family party and I grab a cookie and people are like, hey, I thought you were a nutritionist. Don't you eat healthy? It's like, dude, I'm having one cookie, you know, like I'm having a cookie, maybe 2 cookies, and I'm chilling, you know, you've downed 12 beers and eaten like 6 cookies. It's not the same thing. You know, it's not the same thing. So you need to have moderation, but you can also enjoy yourself.
See, I always have that. I always say that I have the 80-20 diet. 80% I'm good. 20%, I'll have a donut once in a while. And that donut maybe happen once every 6 months. I don't know. I might have a piece of pizza. I might go through Del Taco and have a taco. I mean, but it's all in moderation. And you're absolutely right. People are like, how can you eat like this? I don't eat like this all the time.
Exactly.
You know, but I will enjoy food. I will enjoy, you know, what's out there. I remember when everything went from get away from all the fats. Remember that fad? I don't know. Were you born then?
Yes.
And everything went, it's like everything was fat free. So everything was full of sugar at that point in time. You know, they just pounded the sugar. And that was like, I was laughing at that. What are your thoughts on carb cycling?
I think it can be a useful tool. I think some of these things matter a little bit more, Lori, for like more advanced athletes, perhaps trying to.
Is that when everybody's dialed in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like carb cycling is not something I would recommend to the vast majority of people. I don't think it's necessary at all. I mean, sometimes you eat higher carbs, sometimes you eat lower carbs. I'm a big fan of consistency. Like find something that you like and works for you and stick to it. And carb cycling is a little bit different than that, right? You're telling people to cycle on and off. Now, from like weight loss or physiological perspective, it doesn't have any unique benefits based off the stuff that we just talked about, right? I think for somebody who is getting super shredded and ready for a bodybuilding competition, then we can have a different conversation here.
Okay.
Because maybe removing the carbs helps them stick to slightly lower calories, so it helps for fat loss. And then intentionally refeeding carbohydrates during certain periods can help with performance, particularly if you're going on stage, consuming carbohydrates to look full, right? To fill up your glycogen stores, to fill up your muscle bellies. But for the general population, I would not recommend it at all. I know people talk about like carb cycling, so you're more insulin sensitive and then you consume carbohydrates and you use it for fuel, and it doesn't work that way.
Doesn't work that way.
The same way as like the thing about intermittent fasting that we were talking about earlier.
Yes. And there was I just listened to this long podcast on one of my trips, and it was all about intermittent fasting. And it went from 12 hours to 16 hours to 24 hours and what happens to your body in between. I'm like, man, I'm laughing about this only because I'm like, I'm at that age to where it's like, I'm supposed to go and get that one yearly thing of the colonoscopy and I have to fast all day long. And I'm like, I don't know if I've never went an entire day without eating my entire life. I never have. And I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. I really don't know if I can do this. It's like, I'm pushing that aside.
Well, you know what the irony is? It's like, most people fast 12 hours every day.
Oh yeah, I know,
right?
I do.
Maybe you eat dinner at 8 p.m. and then you eat breakfast at 8 a.m. Like,
sometimes I want to eat until 10.
And the funny thing is like, and people make it seem like if you spend another 4 hours without eating, it's like a whole magical difference.
Yes.
It's like, God, we all fast every day, and adding a couple hours here or there or taking away a couple hours here or there isn't going to make a drastic difference like that. It's a way to like market something that's a little bit different, sounds super sexy, and like people are going to buy into it, right? I was hanging out with my dad yesterday for Father's Day, and I tend to think of my dad as somebody who has pretty good common sense, like doesn't fall for bullshit. And he shows me his phone and he's like, have you heard of this lady, Dr. So-and-so? And he brings a little duffel bag and he opens it. He has all her supplements. He's spent hundreds of dollars on these supplements. And my dad has issues with his blood pressure. And he's like, Joey, watch this video. She says that if you take her supplement for 30 days, you will have no blood pressure issues. And the supplement is $40. Okay. I was like, Dad, if this were true, first off, the supplement would cost thousands of dollars.
Way more than that. Yes.
Second off, if this were true, if you took this for 30 days and your blood pressure issues went away, would you tell all your friends that have blood pressure issues? He was like, yeah. And I was like, you probably think they would tell all their friends too. I was like, this would be the most famous thing in the world. And there would be no need for blood pressure medication. So like
Pfizer would be pissed.
Yeah. And I was like, how come nobody knows about this? And he's like, yeah, that's a good point. I'm like, dude, you're getting your money robbed. And the thing is, if you look at the ingredient list, there are some things that have been shown to help blood pressure a little bit, right? But this lady is saying that it's going to completely eliminate your blood pressure issues. And then we know that the supplement industry isn't well regulated. And I showed him the bottle. I'm like, Dad, if it does not say GMP certified, if this is not certified and it's been checked to have the stuff that it says it has, this could just be a sugar pill. Like you don't know what you're taking, right?
No idea.
And it's the same thing in the nutrition space, right? Like people kind of get this feel in the supplement space, even though people love supplements. There's a reason why the supplement industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry and people won't pay $10 for a gym membership, which is mind-blowing.
I know. They would rather take that magic pill.
Yeah. Here, for anybody listening, I'm just going to say it straight up. If you're not lifting, if you're not exercising, like don't even be worrying about your diet. You should like spend that energy and effort into exercise. It's going to have a massive return on investment.
You're absolutely 100%, 1,000% right on that one. And absolutely, people, they would rather spend money going to the doctor, getting Ozempic, having that, what is it, like it's a shot once a week or something, or once a month, I think it is. You know, and they don't want to train. They don't want to go to the gym. And it's mind blowing, you know, that how, and I don't want to say they're lazy, but I will.
I'd love to touch on this for a moment.
Please.
Because
absolutely.
In our coaching service, in our membership, we actually have a couple of our members who use medications like these. And I've worked one-on-one with people that have used these medications. And again, I think everything is nuanced. There's pros and cons here. And I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have an expertise here, so I'm just talking about my experience working with people. I worked with one client in particular, and I do think it can help some people, right? Because the same way we were talking about how like, hey, some people just have genetic issues, etc. There are some people that have a really hard time regulating their hunger, right? And so I've had clients that use medication as almost like something to then allow them to focus a little bit more on their nutrition and training. And I've seen how powerful it can be when they also focus on healthy lifestyle modification, right? And we have one member in our community right now who is doing this, and like she was doing this exclusively and nothing else. And I talked to her and I was like, hey, listen, like, let's focus on small nutritional changes. Let's start resistance training. And she's been doing it in conjunction to medication, feeling really, really good. And she actually just went to her doctor and asked her doctor to put her on a slightly lower dose because she's feeling so good with all the stuff that she's doing. So I think if people use it and it permits them to focus on healthy lifestyle as well, kudos. Anything that helps you focus on living a healthier lifestyle, I'm all for it, right? Like people who smoke cigarettes and use nicotine patches, hey, that's a step in the right direction, right? Like, would you want to get off of nicotine patches? Ultimately, yeah, sure. But if it helps you move in the right direction, we're moving in the right direction.
Yes.
I just don't like when people just use it as a crutch and nothing else,
100%.
right? Or when people like don't have an issue at all and they just want to use it because they want to lose 10 pounds for the summer. That's like, come on, like that's not good. But I have seen that it can be beneficial for some people that have really been struggling for a long time. So
what do you tell your female?
I don't know. I hate saying that it's good or bad.
No, I get that. I understand that. It's kind of like maybe at the very like out of the gate kind of situation, like maybe the first 2-3 weeks, and then let's get rid of that. What do you tell your female clients when they come to you and they go, I just want this amazing body, but I don't really want to lift weights because I don't want to get bulky? What do you tell your female clients?
I show them pictures of all the female clients that I've worked with that haven't gotten bulky.
So you just jump to it. Here you go.
Well, here's the thing. Because I have had this conversation before, like a requirement to work with me is to lift weights. Because I'll tell you up front, I say I'm biased, but I don't think it's biased. If we look at the research literature, like lifting weights is very, very beneficial, not just for the way you look, but for your health, right? Like, hey, bone density is really important. The only thing that's going to make your bones stronger is lifting weights. And yes, cardio is great for your cardiovascular health, and I highly recommend cardiovascular exercise, but you could get a pretty good cardiovascular workout from lifting weights.
Oh, yeah.
You and I know, like if you
my heart's pumping.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I've done VO2 max tests. I do zero cardio. I lift and I walk 10,000 steps every day. And my VO2 max is not excellent, but it's above average. It's good, right? So, and I don't do any cardio. I could do some cardio to be a little bit better. But anyways, that's just to say that you can get a cardiovascular.
You can do that when you're older.
But for women, here's the thing. First and foremost, even if you could get massive, it doesn't happen overnight, right? It doesn't happen overnight. So at the point where you felt uncomfortably big, this is what I tell my clients. I'm like, hey, if at any point you feel too big, let me know and we could tone it down.
We'll dial it back.
We never get there because it takes years to put on quality muscle, right? Two, women start to notice that when you lift weights, it's really empowering. It's really cool when you get stronger and you're lifting heavier weights. It's awesome. It's cool. It's badass when that chick's lifting some heavy ass weight in the gym. It's cool, right? So like there's an identity shift that starts to occur as well from people who don't lift weights, and then they start to see all the benefits and then they like crave lifting weights.
Yes.
Right. And the other aspect's like, hey, women just don't naturally have really high testosterone. Some women, again, genetically may have higher testosterone than other women's and may be more susceptible to building more muscle. But the majority of women just do not have sufficient testosterone to get absolutely jacked. It's just not.
Thank you for saying that, because my go-to is always, you're not designed that way. And what I mean by you're not designed that way is exactly that. You don't have the testosterone in your body to actually get massive unless, like you said, it's kind of like they have that naturally high testosterone, but the majority, 99%, no, we don't have that, and we have to work hard at this muscle thing.
Yeah. And even most men can't get super jacked.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, I'm in the fitness profession and like, I love training like a bodybuilder. I love living like a bodybuilder. I've been training really hard 5 days a week, 14 years now. And like, I take off my shirt, I'm in shape. I look good, I have some muscle, but I don't look like somebody who's been dedicating their life to lifting weights, Part of it is because I'm just not genetically built like that. I'm relatively lanky. I'm 6'5". It's hard to...
You are 6'5"?
Yeah, it's hard to fill out my frame. I have a swimmer's body. I'm narrow and I'm long. Like, I have really long arms, I have narrow shoulders, I have narrow hips. So another thing is like when you have narrow bone structure, when you have smaller joints, that's directly correlated with how much muscle mass you can put on. People who tend to be wider bone structure and stockier when it comes to bone structure, that person can put on more muscle, right? So like if a woman is listening to this and you tend to be like narrower shoulders, you tend to have small wrists, small ankles, you're likely not going to put on a ton of muscle mass, right? You could look a little bit more toned, look a little bit better, but you're not going to get jacked. I wish it worked that way.
Right? It would be so much easier.
Yeah.
Joey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I could talk for hours, and believe it or not, I was only thinking of 30, 45 minutes with you, and we're already at an hour, and it just flew by. And this is my passion, like the conversation. I could just sit and talk for it. So I hope that I can have you back on when you have time again.
Anytime.
I mean, this is an amazing conversation. More people need to know. And yes, you have the doctor in front of your name. You've done the research. You've put in the work. And that's where I believe that people, they should absolutely pay attention to what you're saying, because of the fact, I mean, yes, I that's why I started following you. And I was just like, wow, he's really good. His information is fascinating. So tell everybody, please, Dr. Joey Munoz, where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me in a couple of different places. I'm really active mainly on Instagram at Dr. Joey Munoz. I'm sure will links be down in the description.
Absolutely. Please tell us though, because somebody might be just listening.
Yeah, at Dr. Joey Munoz, just dr.joeymunoz. I say Instagram is my most entertaining content, not my most educational, because I like debunking stuff and just making fun videos to watch. If you want more like in-depth education from me, check out my podcast, which is just the Dr. Joey Munoz Show. Spelled the same way, obviously. And if you potentially want to work with us and be part of our community, we help people. Our whole thing is help people lose fat, build muscle, and get in great shape for good. And what I mean by for good is by developing healthy and sustainable habits around nutrition and training, right? When it comes to nutrition, we have a very habit-focused approach where we help our members develop a number of healthy nutrition habits on a weekly basis. When it comes to training, we teach all of our members how to optimize their training for muscle growth. So we actually collect videos from our members and give them feedback on what their technique looks like. So it's like having a personal trainer in your pocket, which is really catchy line. And then we really emphasize community. So I really do think community is something that people are missing for accountability and sustainability. Because like it's hard to do things on your own. And if you don't have people rooting for you in real life, it's hard, right? So we really emphasize community. Our members are there sharing wins, cheering each other on every day. And we do coaching calls 3 times a week as well. So if you have any questions, you can hop on with with myself or one of our coaches to get your questions answered. And that's just at fitforlifeacademy.health/membership. And that's FIT for the number 4 life.health. No, fitforlifeacademy.health/membership. It's a mouthful. It'll be down in the description.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joey, so much. I so appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, and we will absolutely talk again. And listeners, thank you so much for tuning in here to Chillin' with Ice. And this is where legends live on. Thank you so much for listening to Chillin' with Ice. And don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share wherever you listen to your podcast. Remember to follow us on Patreon and YouTube at Chillin' with Ice. And on Instagram and TikTok, you can follow me at lori.ice.fetrick. I look forward to chilling with you next time here on Chillin' with Ice.